Peterson, thanks so much for joining us. The persecution of members of Jehovah's Witnesses may be a chapter of the Holocaust you are not familiar with. I know I wasn't. Two survivors are in the Quad Cities for speaking engagements sponsored by the Social Action Connection at Blackhawk College and the Western Illinois University Quad Cities campus student activities. At age 12, Rudolf Greichen refused to join the Hitler Youth. Joseph Kempler was a Polish Jew who in his teens was sent to a concentration camp. His entire family died except for his sister, who was hidden from the Nazis by a Jehovah's Witness family, and he later converted to the faith. Thank you both very much for your time, and you both have a unique perspective, shall we say, to the Holocaust, to your experiences. Mr. Greichen, we'd like to start with you, and then Mr. Kempler will find out a little bit about your experience. Explain for us, first of all, why the Nazis took exception to members of Jehovah's Witness, because you were German, so what is it they did not like about the faith?
But it was not an issue of race. It was, as with the Jewish population, but it was an issue, a clash of ideologies. The Jehovah's Witnesses did not believe that one imperfect human has a right to demand from everybody else obedience to his demands. Mm-hmm. We believed that all mankind should be obedient to an authority, yes, but the highest authority is God himself. And if all people would obey the instructional laws God gave us in his instructions, the world would look different. And this, the Nazis did not want to get too far out of hand. They wanted to control people. Well, that's the idea of dictators. And
Jehovah's Witnesses are also, if I'm correct, conscientious objectors when it comes to serving in the military?
Yes. Yes, and of course that clashed also with the Nazi ideology to conquer the whole world and dominate not just one country, but the whole world.
We're not so much conscientious objectors as we are neutral. And there's a difference in here. We didn't object, but we didn't want to participate in any form of warfare.
Mr. Kempler, while we're on you, I'll ask you this. As I said, you were in Poland, and your family was of the Jewish faith. Right. At that time, had you even heard of Jehovah's Witnesses? Because there weren't that many in that part of the world, really.
No, I never heard about them. As a matter of fact, the first time I met them was in a concentration camp. And after I left Germany and came to the United States, I thought that I never thought that Witnesses were anyplace else. I thought there was only some form of a German group. So I was totally misinformed and didn't know anything about them.
Well, we'll find out in just a little bit how you later became involved and converted to the faith. Mr. Greichen, I understand that you were taken out of school, you and your sister. You were age 12. Why was that?
Well, my father was picked up by the Gestapo and sentenced to 5 years of prison in 1937. And by court order, it was decided to take us children away from the so-called bad influence of our parents. So they took us, one day we went to school and we had to go to see the principal, but we hadn't done anything bad, so we went there, and when we got to the principal's office, there was already a policeman sitting there, and they told us we could not go back to our mother because they had to take us, the policeman took us to a reformatory school in order to be readjusted in our thinkings or our beliefs or our convictions according to Nazi ideology. That's why they took us away.
This school then, what kind of things did they teach you or try to teach you?
Well, when it was at the same time, or just a little bit before they took us to a reformatory school, the Nazis had already achieved, or tried at least to achieve, 100% of participation of young people in the country to join the Hitler Youth organization. And that started already in school, the indoctrination. At that time, my teacher in my class was always one little boy short of 100% participation, and nothing was acceptable unless it was 100% participation. And so it seemed to me that some of the other teachers might have made fun of my teachers. How come you cannot achieve 100% participation? And so finally he decided, okay, I'm going to do something to solve that problem once and for all. So one day he told other boys, tomorrow there will be no class, we go on an outing, on a trip, field trip. But he said, I wish that everybody put on the uniform tomorrow morning. That when we walk through town, then everybody sees you're all nice Hitler boys. Well, when we came next day to school, and I just had a bluish-gray sweater on, so he called me to the front and says, well, turn around and look at your school comrades, and then look at yourself, he said. And what do you think about that? And I said, well, there's nothing wrong. I was only 12 years old. I didn't really know where I was driving at. And I said, well, there's nothing wrong. My mom just washed it last night. And they said, no, there's nothing wrong. But don't you also agree, he said, that you don't fit in your school comrades output appearing in a uniform? Well, then I saw where I was driving at. When he said, well, I know your parents are poor people and cannot afford to buy you a uniform. But he says, come up here, let me show you something. So I went to his podium, his desk, and he opened a drawer, and then he said, but look at that, he said, isn't that beautiful? And there was a brand new uniform in there. He himself had bought that, and he says, I wonder what you look like in the uniform. Well, he was very enthusiastic about it, but I was feeling rather to drop dead right here instead of being found alive in a Nazi uniform. And when he saw that I had school books, then he said, well, don't you worry about it. I understand your feeling. He tried to get me into that uniform one way or another, with one trick or with another. And he said, all I want to know if it fits you. Wouldn't you like to find out if it fits you?
And you were only 12.
12 years old.
So how is it that you were able to
resist that?
To resist that, yes, and not go along with the other children?
Well, here's where the parents come in to teach their children, to set the right example. If parents don't set the right example, what do we expect from children? And that's still true also in this country. But my parents had told me already as little children that Nazis are bad people, a bad system, and it leads to a horrible disaster for the whole nation. And I accepted the judgment of my parents. And so since the Nazis had already taken my father away and put in prison, I was determined I don't want to become one of them. And so no propaganda and no indoctrination and no persuasion could change my mind. I had made my mind up. They had done this so badly mistreated, have interfered with the happiness of our family life, and then taken us away as little children from a safe home in a family. And I was determined I don't want to become of them.
Mr. Kepler, you were also taken away when you were very young. Was it 14? You
Yes.
went to the first of, what, half a dozen concentration camps?
That's right.
Now, your whole family went except for your sister?
That's right. My sister is the only survivor of my family, and she was hidden by Jehovah's Witnesses, even though at that time I did not know who they were, and she didn't know either, because they were known by a different name in Poland. It was, and she was hidden by them under great danger for 2 years and 3 months.
Now, how did it come about then that a group of individuals that you weren't even that aware of came to hide your sister? How did that whole thing come about?
Well, she was married. Her husband was a musician, and he taught one of the children of the Witness family to play violin. And then when the time came for the cleaning out the ghetto in town, they invited him to come in. They didn't know at the time how long the war would last, but nevertheless they were committed to keep them right through until the end of the war, at a great threat to themselves.
Did she explain much about where she was hidden or how they
Yes.
went about doing that?
Yes. This was a small city apartment, which makes it particularly difficult as compared with being hidden someplace in a village. So they were in one big room, and they were standing all day behind the wardrobe, while the one large European wardrobes, and at night they will pull it away so they can lie down, but they stayed the whole time behind the wardrobe, absolutely silent without making any noise. It was tremendous. I mean, it was a very difficult thing. I mean, she practically became a nervous wreck as a result. It was very stressful for her husband, as well as the witnesses.
Yeah. Now, were the witnesses free to come and go? How is it that the witnesses in Poland weren't taken to concentration camps?
Many of them were, but the action against witnesses was not as concentrated, apparently, as it was in other countries. Now, I did not know the details about this family, as my sister didn't know. They were sort of spend their life behind the wardrobe, and didn't know what was going on outside. So this is not quite clear. But even in Germany, only about half of the witnesses were arrested, which is a substantial amount, but didn't cover everybody.
Yes, I understand that the witnesses could have avoided arrest or gotten out of prison or concentration camps by merely signing a document denouncing their faith, right? Unlike those of the Jewish faith.
Right. That's very true. That was the only group in concentration camps who had a choice, namely to sign a document to renounce their faith in God and Jesus and the Bible and become traitors to the rest of their religious organization, and from then on work together with the Nazis and the Gestapo. Well, how can a person keep a clean conscience to sign that paper and not even think on fulfilling it? So it was a matter of conscience, and it was also a matter of honesty. And that's why Jehovah's Witnesses didn't want to sign that.
This was the witnesses' point of view. When I came to camp number 5 in Austria, this is when I first saw the witnesses. They were surrounded, they had a barrack which was surrounded by its own barbed wire that I have never seen before. But the rest of the camp was surrounded by electrical wire. There never was an individual barrack which was isolated this way. So of course this attracted attention. What kind of criminals are these? How dangerous they must be.
That they have a prison inside a prison.
Right. So the question was, who are they? And I was told that they are Jehovah's Witnesses. And I had no idea who Jehovah's Witnesses were, but I knew they were German Aryans, which was in itself a very strange thing to see in a camp. And then I found out, among other things, that they can go free by simply signing a statement renouncing their religion. And we couldn't believe it. This was totally beyond belief, comprehension, because any one of us would have signed anything to get away. And we were questioning this. Why don't they sign? They can believe whatever they want to. Nobody knows what's in their mind. Sign the statement and get out. And they wouldn't. And this was a totally incomprehensible. They didn't understand how this can happen. Why people would stand up for something they believed in. I mean, they were not fanatics. And they were in the camp much longer than other people, sometimes all the way from 1933. So there was a tremendous admiration for the people, for the Jehovah's Witnesses, even though nobody knew what they believed. And the interesting thing was, what they believed wasn't important. It's their stand and their position and their humanity. Most of us by that time, other prisoners, we became no longer human. There's only one goal in our lives, is to survive, not to survive the war, but essentially, excuse me, to survive the day or the hour. And these people stayed there voluntarily and behaved, I mean, like, they, even though they had positions of responsibility, because the Germans began to trust them. In other words, for instance, the warehouses, the kitchens, the places like this, they were given to Jehovah's Witnesses because they wouldn't steal, they wouldn't perform any, underhand.
They knew they wouldn't try to run away.
Right, and they wouldn't run away. I remember one time I saw the gate of the camp open, and the man in striped uniform went outside by himself. And I couldn't believe that. So one of the prisoners said, "Oh no, this is a witness, he's not going to escape." So this was behavior which we never saw before. Especially, this was a form of resistance. It was a spiritual resistance. I've never seen any form of resistance to the Nazis. So this was a totally admirable and a totally unexpected thing, and really gave me a great spiritual uplift, because I believed there were no more any humans left in the world. I mean, I was a kid, I didn't know the world, but the whole world became the world of concentration camp. So we were inhuman, the Germans were inhuman, we felt there was no humanity left. So what's the purpose of surviving, even if we could? So these people, the witnesses, sort of gave us an inkling, maybe there is a world worthwhile surviving for.
So they gave you some hope.
Tremendous. You see, little things like this became so important. And I was never allowed to speak to them, the big penalty for trying to speak to the witnesses. And this is the reason, incidentally, why they put them behind barbed wire, because otherwise they would go out and talk to the other prisoners to give them hope. And this was dangerous to the Germans. So they kept them locked up in this way.
Mr. Greichen, as Mr. Kempler mentioned, I was going to ask you this, he said we would have signed anything to get out, and couldn't witnesses have signed something renouncing their faith, but in their heart of hearts, remaining true to it, but doing this just to save themselves and their families? Because we've heard of people who joined the Nazi Party just so their families would be spared.
That was also the reasoning many times of the SS guards. They said to Jehovah's Witnesses, sign that lousy paper and get out of here. I would do that. You can believe and do what you want to after that. But that is a foolish reasoning, because you could not get out. They would watch you. Every step you would take, you would be under guard and with the watchful eyes. So that was also the reason why, well, I touched on that already, it was a matter of conscience. To be honest to God, how can one have a good conscience both for himself, both for his family, or before God, when he starts lying? It just doesn't fit together. Did you ever know of anyone who did decide to sign the paper and get out, whether they really meant it or not? Yes, it has happened, sure. But that were very few. And that was the reason why the Nazis tried to treat Jehovah's Witnesses as the rest of the inmates. They did not want to kill Jehovah's Witnesses. They wanted to use them or misuse them for their purpose. Because even Himmler said, if all the SS men would have that kind of a conviction to stand up for their faith and their convictions, when we would conquer the whole world. Because he knew that not even his own people have this kind of a conviction. Yes. So that made even a deep impression on the Nazis. That stand firm for principles, for faith, for believing in what to do, what is right, and not be a hypocrite, say that and do the opposite.
Yes, Himmler really, according to this particular story that Rudy is telling, he felt that the 1,000-year Reich of Hitler would survive if there were other people who were as loyal to Hitler as the witnesses were to God. So rather than killing them off, he wanted to persuade them by this kind of temptation, signing a statement and so on, to come to join the Nazi Party, and this way lengthen the existence of the Third Reich.
Yet some witnesses were indeed killed, right?
Well, many were killed. Some were executed. Even about 200 to 300, 350 were executed because of the military issue.
The military service?
Yeah, that's what they did. And that's what made an impression that people, young people, who had their life still before themselves, were willing to die instead of just collapsing, caving in, and work together with the Nazis and get out of that. Yeah. And that's what made them so change their attitude to Jehovah's Witnesses. We can use these people. They are not stupid. They are educated, but they have a determination, a faith to live for. And if we could get that and use that for our purposes, we would be in a good shape. That's why they treated Jehovah's, or tried to treat Jehovah's Witnesses different, to persuade them for their purposes.
Mm-hmm. About 25% of the German witnesses died, which is the lowest death rate of anybody in a concentration camp, even though they were the longest. And part of this was that the tremendous support they gave to each other. There are many stories about the survival under impossible conditions, where the witnesses would help one another. But most of the others would not do that. It was survival at any cost, including the life of others. So it was a totally different attitude. It was totally, I mean, like day and night between the general prisoner in a camp for many nations and Jehovah's Witnesses were totally unique. Truly humanity at its best.
Yet, there weren't that many witnesses in Germany and Poland, so given the overall population, about half were imprisoned or put in concentration camps.
And the amazing thing was that in spite of the fact there were so few witnesses and they were divided into many, many camps, even a few of them in any one camp made a tremendous impression on all the prisoners, including Nazi guards. They didn't understand them, but everybody admired them. They had tremendous respect for what they stood for. Because this was totally unseen and unheard in any place. I mean, particularly in the world of concentration camps, this was a totally incredible behavior.
Now, you were able, after you got out of the camp, to eventually make your way to the United States, and you did convert to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
As someone who grew up in a devout Jewish family, that's a pretty big leap. So why did you decide to make that decision?
Well, for one thing, I was so impressed by Jehovah's Witnesses. They gave me the spiritual uplift maybe that I needed in a camp, and I never forgot them, even though I didn't know that they existed any place outside of Germany. And I was in New York, maybe it was about 9 years, or 8 or 9 years after I arrived in this country. They showed up at my door. I didn't know who they were, and turned out to be Jehovah's Witnesses. And my question was, tell me, how could these witnesses in Germany withstand the kind of torture there? I mean, I knew what it was all about. How could they do it? And this was something which plagued me. How could people do this? And in the process of explaining it to me, I became more interested. They were totally different than any other group, or Christian group. So I began to ask questions. I didn't want to have any part of religion. This was totally, the interest was in their behavior, not in their religion. But what they taught me fitted so well with what I believed as a Jew, that it became to me something which I wanted to believe that, in spite of the fact that I was not interested in religion. And eventually I was convinced that they teach the truth, and I wanted to become one of them. It became rather difficult because my faith in God, or trust in God, was sort of ruined by the war. So it took me a long time. It wasn't typical conversion. So I really struggled with it, but I was truly convinced by my knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures as a child, and the way it was filled in and explained by the witnesses. It made perfect sense.
Mr. Gleichen, what happened to your family after the war? Were you and your sister and mother and father reunited, or what happened?
Well, my father, after the war had ended, came back, but he was very, very sick and died very soon after the war. I was still very young, just 20 years old, and when a person is young, he can bounce back, because I was just skin and bones and pretty sick too. But young people can recover. But my mother, she didn't sign that paper, and they took her to a concentration camp that was made just for women in Ravensbrück. And she died there just about 2 months before the Second World War came to an end, and everybody was liberated after that. So she never came back, no. She was one of the victims.
And then what happened to your sister?
And my sister, she was never put into prison, because most of the Nazi tried to get the main members of Jehovah's Witnesses out of the way. And ladies of Jehovah's Witnesses were only picked up when there were couriers, what we say, to take some Bible literature from one congregation or from one of Jehovah's Witnesses to another Jehovah's Witnesses family. When they picked up those, in a raid, they put him in a concentration camp too. But my sister was not one of those, and so she was never put into prison. But she died about 5 years ago.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but how did you go about finding your sister and her husband after the war? How did you get to be reunited?
Well, after the war, our primary occupation was to find our family. And this took a search with all kinds of misinformation. And finally, we found each other accidentally. Somebody saw us someplace in Germany, and I wrote a letter to her addressed to a displaced person camp someplace in Germany with no address. We happened to find each other. I mean, this was accidental, but the stories like this were happening throughout the survivor groups after the war. So we found each other. It was about 7 or 8 months after the war. It was a miraculous thing, really.
Quickly, if you could, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a chapter, the Holocaust, I was not aware of, and probably a lot of other people weren't. I suppose that is part of your reason for your speaking engagements that you make, is to get the word out more about this so that people know?
Right, that's very true. That's why our program stands also under the subheading, the unknown or the untold story of the Holocaust, because most of the people here in the United States have never heard anything. Everybody has heard some that 6 million Jews got killed during this terrible time of the Nazi time concentration camp. But the official number is between 11 and 15 million people who died. So in other words, the majority of the people in this country have heard only half the story, but never heard anything about the rest of the other 6 or 8 million people who were in prison in the concentration camp who also died.
I'm sorry, we're out of time, but I want to thank both of you for being on the program, and thank you for sharing your story with the residents of the Quad Cities as well.
Yeah.